When my daughter told me to stop talking to the neighbors, I didn't question her at first. She said it one evening in that brisk, efficient tone she used for everything in life, whether closing a business deal or correcting me on how to load the dishwasher. "They're gossips, Mom," she'd said. "They twist things. Don't let them drag you into their nonsense." And like always, I nodded. It wasn't that I agreed. I just didn't want to argue. At 58, after the slow, quiet years that followed my husband's death, I'd grown used to letting my daughter steer the conversation, the household, my life. She was all I had left nearby. My son lived 3 states away. And I suppose I was afraid of losing her too. Our neighborhood was small, the kind where everyone waved from driveways and baked pies for newcomers. I had always liked it. The rhythm of lawnmowers on Saturday mornings, the smell of barbecue drifting from patios, the small talk across fences. But slowly, after Claire's visits grew more frequent, that soundscape changed. She'd shake her head whenever she caught me chatting with Mrs. Watkins, my elderly next-door neighbor. "That woman thrives on drama," Claire would say. "She probably spreads stories about you." So I stopped. Out of politeness, out of fear, out of love. Maybe all 3. Weeks turned into months. I watched life unfold from behind curtains. The neighbors still smiled and waved, but there was distance now. A wall, invisible, yet solid. I told myself it didn't matter. Claire said she wanted the best for me. She said people could take advantage of vulnerable older women. And she didn't want that for me. Her protectiveness felt flattering at first, until it didn't. The truth is, my world had shrunk. Calls from friends went unanswered because she said most of them just wanted attention. Invitations to community events gathered dust on my kitchen counter. I convinced myself I was content. I had my garden, my books, and Claire's weekly visits. Still, sometimes at night, when the house was too quiet, I'd wonder why I felt lonelier than ever before. Then, one March afternoon, she mentioned she'd be leaving for a business trip, 5 days in Chicago. I remember feeling a flicker of excitement that startled me. Freedom. That's what it felt like. She gave me a list of instructions before leaving: how to handle bills, which calls to avoid, even what groceries to buy. "Don't talk to anyone about personal matters," she added, smiling in that half-joking, half-warning way. After she left, the silence was different. Open, breathable. I spent the next day tending to the garden, pruning roses that hadn't bloomed properly since last summer. The sky was clear, the air crisp. For the first time in months, I felt like myself. That was when Mrs. Watkins appeared by the fence. She stood there in her straw hat and gardening gloves, as if she'd been waiting for me. Her expression was gentle but serious. "Elizabeth," she said softly, "may I come in for a minute?" Something in her tone made my stomach twist. We sat on the porch. I poured lemonade, hands trembling slightly. From nerves, from curiosity. She looked at me for a long moment, as if weighing whether to speak at all. Finally, she said, "I wasn't going to tell you. But you deserve to know who your daughter really is." The words didn't make sense at first. My daughter? Who my daughter really is. Mrs. Watkins spoke slowly, choosing every word. She told me things I didn't want to hear, about people in town whispering that Claire had taken advantage of elderly clients at her real estate firm, convincing them to sign over property for investment. About a woman down the street who'd trusted her and lost her savings. About how Claire's charm could turn to cruelty when questioned. I listened, frozen. My throat felt dry, my heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to interrupt, to defend my daughter, to say it was a mistake, gossip, jealousy. But something inside me hesitated, because I'd seen flashes of it before. Small moments I'd brushed aside. The way Claire spoke to waiters, her sharp tone when I asked about her work, the fear that crept into her eyes when I mentioned looking through Dad's old paperwork. I'd ignored it all, convinced myself she was simply busy, ambitious, misunderstood. Now, hearing Mrs. Watkins lay out pieces of a puzzle I'd refused to assemble. I felt the ground tilt. When she finished, she reached for my hand. "I'm sorry, dear. I know she's your daughter. But please, be careful. You're not the first her fingers were warm. Mine were ice." I thanked her mechanically, walked her to the gate, and stood there until she disappeared down the sidewalk. Inside, the house felt foreign, as if I'd stepped into someone else's life. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the framed photo of Claire and me from her college graduation. She was smiling, radiant, her hand resting on my shoulder. I'd been so proud that day. The air felt thick. I tried to tell myself Mrs. Watkins was mistaken, that she was just repeating small-town gossip, the very thing Claire had warned me about. But the unease wouldn't leave. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed every conversation with my daughter over the past year. Every decision she'd made, for my own good. The canceled dinner invitations, the friends she'd dismissed, the forms she'd asked me to sign when she handled my finances. By morning, doubt had turned into dread. I sat with my coffee, staring out the window as the neighborhood woke up. Children rushed to school, cars pulled out of driveways, and somewhere a dog barked. Ordinary life, steady and indifferent. Yet for me, something irreversible had shifted. If Mrs. Watkins was right, then my daughter, my only daughter, wasn't protecting me. She was isolating me. The thought felt like betrayal and failure all at once. I told myself I was to blame for being naive, for letting her dictate my world so completely. What kind of mother doesn't know what her own child is capable of? All morning, I moved through the house like a ghost. Every familiar object felt tainted by suspicion. The walls seemed to hum with secrets I'd chosen not to see. I picked up the phone twice to call Claire, to confront her, to demand an explanation. But I couldn't. The fear wasn't just of what she might say. It was of hearing confirmation in her voice. By afternoon, I sat on the couch, staring at the framed photographs on the mantel. Family holidays, birthdays, graduations. All smiles, all illusions of safety. For the first time in my life, I wished my husband were still alive. He'd always seen through people, even the ones he loved. Maybe he would have seen through her. The day stretched endlessly. I couldn't focus on reading or television. Even the ticking of the clock felt loud, mocking. When night fell, I lay awake listening to the wind against the windows, and something inside me broke. Quietly, almost gently. The version of motherhood I'd built, the image of devotion and pride, cracked open to reveal something darker: dependence, fear, blindness. I didn't cry. I just stared into the darkness, whispering to myself the same question over and over. What have I done? The morning after Mrs. Watkins's visit, I sat in the kitchen surrounded by silence. The kind that doesn't comfort. The kind that asks questions you don't want to answer. The sunlight fell across the table, revealing dust I hadn't noticed before. I watched it drift in the air, glittering briefly before vanishing. It reminded me of my life these past few years, small, fading moments of self that I had let disappear. I didn't want to believe Mrs. Watkins, but disbelief requires evidence, and the more I searched for it, the less I found. I opened my filing cabinet, the one Claire had organized to help. Each folder was labeled neatly in her handwriting: utilities, taxes, insurance, legal. I remembered how she'd insisted on handling all the paperwork after her father died. "It's easier this way, Mom," she'd said. "You don't need to worry about details." I'd thanked her. I'd let her. Now, flipping through the papers, I saw her name everywhere. Joint accounts, power of attorney, even on the property deed of the house. At the time, I hadn't questioned it. She'd explained it all in the same patient, slightly patronizing tone she used when I couldn't figure out my smartphone. I sat there, heart pounding, realizing how thoroughly I had surrendered control. For years, I'd thought I was being cared for. Now it looked more like I'd been managed. I closed the cabinet and leaned back in the chair, feeling dizzy. The house, my house, no longer felt like mine. I thought about all the things I'd given up without noticing. My friends, my hobbies, even the simple act of deciding for myself. Claire's influence had been like water, gentle, constant, eroding me grain by grain. I had become an obedient echo of my own life. The day stretched on in slow motion. Around noon, I went outside and sat on the porch, watching Mrs. Watkins water her garden. When she noticed me, she raised a cautious hand. I smiled faintly but didn't go over. I wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. Instead, I tried to remember the last time I'd felt free. The memory that came to mind wasn't grand. It was from years ago, before Claire took over. I had driven alone to a coastal town, stayed in a small inn, spent hours walking along the shore. No one had known where I was. No one had called. I'd felt invisible, but in the best way, unobserved, unneeded, alive. That woman, the one who had booked the trip without permission or apology, felt like a stranger now. In the afternoon, I decided to call my son, Nathan. We hadn't spoken properly in months. He answered with his usual calm voice, surprised to hear from me. I told him things had been strange lately. I didn't mention details, only that I was feeling uneasy about Claire's involvement in my affairs. He hesitated before answering. Then, carefully, he said, "Mom, I've had that feeling for a while." His words struck like lightning. He told me that Claire had once contacted him, asking him to sign documents related to future inheritance, something about simplifying estate planning. When he'd asked for clarification, she'd told him it was none of his concern. After that, she'd stopped speaking to him altogether. I felt sick. Nathan's tone was gentle, but there was sadness beneath it. "I didn't want to worry you," he said, "but if you think something's wrong, trust that feeling. Claire's smart, but she doesn't always know where the line is." When the call ended, I sat for a long time, gripping the phone. My hands were cold. I went into the bedroom and opened the drawer of my nightstand. Inside was a box of old letters, photos, and my late husband's watch. The sight of it steadied me. He'd always believed in reason, in evidence over emotion. He used to say that fear was just a signal to pay attention. So I decided to pay attention. That evening, I made a list. A simple one. Nothing fancy. At the top, I wrote what I've lost. Underneath, I started listing friends, trust, confidence, independence, my own voice. I stopped when I realized I was shaking. Then, on a new sheet of paper, I wrote what I still have. For a long time, I couldn't think of anything. Then, finally, time. Clarity. The truth. Maybe. The act of writing it down made something click inside me. I had been living in emotional fog, but now the outlines of my situation were clear. There was danger, yes, but also choice. I could stay silent and comfortable in my ignorance, or I could open the door and face whatever was waiting on the other side. By sunset, I had made my decision. I went to the mirror and looked at myself. Truly looked. My reflection startled me. I saw the lines, the tired eyes, but beneath them something steadier had emerged. Resolve. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't senile or frail. I was a woman who had survived grief, loneliness, and years of quiet control. And now I was done being managed. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, I woke early, brewed coffee, and dialed a number I hadn't used in years, an old friend of my husband's, a retired lawyer named Paul Emerson. He'd helped us buy the house decades ago. He sounded surprised to hear from me, but warm. When I asked if I could meet to discuss something personal, his tone shifted immediately. "Of course, Elizabeth. Tomorrow morning, if that works." It did. After hanging up, I sat back, the phone still in my hand. The decision felt monumental, even though it was just a phone call. For the first time in a long time, I'd acted without permission. That afternoon, I called Mrs. Watkins. I told her gently that I'd heard her, that I appreciated her honesty. I didn't ask for details. Not yet. She said she was glad I was taking things seriously, and that she'd help however she could. Her kindness steadied me more than I expected. As the day faded, I sat on the porch again, watching the light sink behind the trees. The neighborhood felt different now. Not hostile, not distant, but alive again. I could almost feel the quiet pulse of solidarity among the women who had been dismissed, silenced, or called gossips. Maybe that's what frightened my daughter the most. Not gossip, truth shared between women who refused to be small. When night came, I found the strength to whisper to myself, "No more hiding." It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a promise. To see clearly, to speak plainly, to stop apologizing for existing. I didn't know yet what I would uncover or what it would cost. But for the first time in years, I felt awake. And I knew that once you wake up, you can't go back to sleep. Claire came back 2 days earlier than planned. I was in the garden trimming the hydrangeas when I heard her car pull into the driveway. The slam of the car door was sharper than usual, too loud for a calm arrival. I felt that old, familiar tension gather in my chest, like a reflex I couldn't unlearn. She walked up the path briskly, heels clicking, phone in hand, eyes already scanning the house as if checking for signs of disobedience. "You've been talking to the neighbors," she said without greeting, her tone flat but loaded. It wasn't a question. I set down the shears and wiped my hands on my jeans. I told her Mrs. Watkins had stopped by while she was gone. That was all. Claire exhaled sharply, the kind of sound that wasn't quite a sigh, not quite anger. "I told you to stay away from her, Mom. She's a troublemaker." Her words felt rehearsed, controlled. That was her gift, sounding rational while making me feel irrational. I tried to keep my voice calm. She was just being kind. Claire's expression hardened. "You don't understand how people like her operate. She pretends to care, but she loves drama. Did she tell you some ridiculous story about me?" I didn't answer right away, and that silence, my hesitation, told her everything. Her eyes narrowed. "She did, didn't she?" When I said that, Mrs. Watkins had simply mentioned things I found confusing, not necessarily true, she laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. "Of course she did. That woman spreads lies for entertainment. I've seen her do it to other families." The words flowed fast, confident. I recognized the pattern. Overwhelm, deny, redirect. It was how Claire handled anyone who challenged her. She started pacing, gesturing as she spoke. "You've been through a lot since Dad died. You're vulnerable, and people see that. They'll take advantage if you let them. That's why I've tried to protect you." That word, protect, struck something raw. It was the same argument she'd used to justify every restriction, every intrusion. I told her, quietly, that I didn't feel protected. She stopped pacing. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," I said, careful with every word, "I need to make my own choices again. About who I talk to. About my life." Her expression froze. For a moment, she looked like she didn't recognize me. Then her voice dropped, colder now. "Where is this coming from?" "You've been fine for years. You've never wanted to handle things yourself." "That doesn't mean I can't," I said. Claire's face softened, just a fraction, the performance of patience. "Mom, you don't understand how complicated things are. I manage your finances for a reason. You'd be lost, trying to untangle all of it." I could hear my pulse in my ears, but I kept my voice steady. "I've spoken with Paul Emerson." Her eyes widened, a flicker of real emotion. Surprise, maybe even fear. Then she laughed again, high and brittle. "You what?" "He's ancient, Mom. He barely remembers his own name. You can't rely on him for anything serious." "Paul helped us buy this house," I said. "He remembers enough." That stopped her. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she smiled. Slow, practiced. "Okay," she said softly. "So that's how it is now. You don't trust me, it wasn't a question either. I wanted to say that trust wasn't the issue, that I just needed clarity. But the truth was heavier than that. I didn't trust her. Not anymore. She seemed to sense it, because the mask slipped. You're being ridiculous, she snapped. Do you have any idea how much I've done for you? I take care of everything. Bills, taxes, the house, so you don't have to. You should be grateful, not paranoid. Her words hit like stones, each one carefully aimed. I stayed silent. Silence, I realized, was my new weapon. After a few seconds, she exhaled through her nose, muttering something about stress and old age, then turned to leave. I can't deal with this right now, she said. We'll talk when you've calmed down. When she drove away, gravel crunching beneath her tires, I felt my hands trembling. Not from fear, but from restraint. For the first time, I hadn't apologized. That night, she didn't call. The next morning, an email arrived from her, long, structured, filled with bullet points about financial transparency and family boundaries. It was written like a business memo, ending with a line that made my stomach twist. I'm worried you're being manipulated, Mom. Please think carefully about who you're letting into your head. I closed my laptop without replying. Over the next few days, her presence lingered even in her absence. She sent messages, not affectionate ones, but questions disguised as concern. Have you paid the utility bill? Did you talk to anyone else? Did Mrs. Watkins say anything new? Each message was a test, and each unanswered one a victory. But control doesn't surrender easily. On Thursday evening, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, Jessica from across the street stood there holding a casserole dish. Claire asked me to check on you, she said gently. She was worried. The kindness in her eyes was real, but the message wasn't hers. I invited her in, thanked her for the food, and after she left, I locked the door and leaned against it, breathing slowly. It wasn't enough for Claire to manage my finances or isolate me socially. Now she wanted the whole neighborhood to see me as fragile, unstable. It was a perfect tactic. Once people believe you're weak, your truth becomes easy to dismiss. That night, I wrote everything down. Dates, words, even the tone she used. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet, but documenting it made me feel anchored, as if reclaiming my version of events could protect me. 2 days later, she returned again, unannounced. This time she brought a folder of documents. These need your signature, she said coolly. I took them, opened the first page, and saw her name next to mine, joint authorization to transfer assets. I looked up. What's this? She smiled thinly. It's just paperwork. Streamlining your account so I can handle things if something happens to you. Something in her tone, casual, confident, filled me with quiet rage. I'm not signing this, I said. Her eyes flicked up, sharp. Excuse me? I said I'm not signing. The silence that followed was deep and dangerous. I saw it in her face, the calculation, the disbelief. She wasn't used to resistance. Finally, she said, You're making a mistake. People will take advantage of you. You'll lose everything. I handed the folder back to her. Then I'll lose it on my own terms. She stared at me, speechless. Then, with a tight smile, she gathered her things and left. The sound of the door closing behind her felt like a declaration. Later that night, Mrs. Watkins called. She said she'd seen Claire leaving, looking like a thundercloud. I told her not to worry, that it was fine. For the first time, I actually believed it. I went to bed feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Power. Not loud or defiant, but quiet, steady power. Claire would come back. I knew that. She'd change tactics, maybe soften her voice, maybe strike harder. But now, I wasn't the same woman she'd left behind. The war had begun, and I was finally ready to fight. The morning after Claire's second visit, I woke before sunrise. The house was still, the air cool, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel afraid. I felt alert, focused in a way that reminded me of who I'd been long ago, before grief dulled everything. The decision to defend myself wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even emotional. It was simply logical, like something that had been waiting in the background for years, quietly forming shape. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my notebook, the one where I'd been recording everything. Each line felt like a thread, and together they formed a web of control, manipulation, and lies. I wasn't sure where to begin, so I started with what I could control. At 9 a.m., I drove to Paul Emerson's office. The building was old brick, the kind that smelled faintly of dust and paper, the air still and steady. Paul met me with the same calm smile I remembered from my husband's days. His hair was white now, his gait slower, but his eyes were sharp. When I told him why I'd come, he didn't interrupt. He just listened, nodding occasionally, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, hands folded. "You're right to be cautious, Elizabeth," he said quietly. "Your daughter's name appears on several documents she shouldn't have access to. You're not the first parent I've seen in this situation." Hearing those words, "not the first," was both terrifying and comforting. I wasn't alone, and I wasn't crazy. He suggested a few steps: revoke the power of attorney, transfer all remaining assets into a trust in my own name, and close joint accounts. He would prepare the paperwork within the week. Then, after a pause, he added gently, "You'll need to be careful. Once people like your daughter realize they're losing control, they don't react kindly." I nodded. "I know." When I left his office, the sunlight felt too bright. The air seemed to hum with the enormity of what I'd done. It wasn't rebellion. It was self-preservation. That afternoon, I went to the bank. I sat with a young advisor who treated me with the kind of dismissive politeness reserved for older women. But when I produced Paul's letter and asked to remove Claire from all accounts, his tone shifted immediately. Paperwork was signed, documents stamped. Each signature felt like a piece of myself being reclaimed.
By the time I returned home, exhaustion hit me. The physical kind that comes after fear finally gives way to action. I brewed tea, sat by the window, and watched the wind ripple through Mrs. Watkins's garden. She waved when she saw me. I waved back, and that simple gesture felt like solidarity. That evening, Claire called. Her voice was overly calm, almost pleasant. "Hey, Mom," she began. "I just got some notifications from the bank about account changes. Is everything okay?" It took effort to keep my tone even. "Yes," I said. "I met with Paul. He's helping me reorganize things." A pause, then clipped. "You met with Paul again?" "Yes." Her voice shifted instantly, the warmth gone. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't need to." There was a sharp inhale on the other end. "Mom, do you realize how dangerous this is? You're letting that old man confuse you. You could lose everything if you make one mistake."
I felt my heartbeat quicken, but my voice stayed calm. "Then I'll take that risk." Her silence was long and heavy. Then she said, low and cold, "You're making a fool of yourself. And everyone will see it." When she hung up, I exhaled slowly, realizing I'd been gripping the phone too tightly. But instead of collapsing, I smiled. She was rattled. That meant I was finally where I needed to be, unpredictable. Over the next few days, I carried out the rest of Paul's plan. The new trust was established, the property records updated, and all correspondence redirected to my personal address. I even bought a small lockbox for my documents, something simple but symbolically powerful. At night, I began sleeping better. The dreams that had once been restless, images of shadows, of my husband's voice warning me, faded into stillness. Then came the pushback. Claire began showing up unannounced, always with the same mix of charm and menace. One evening, she brought dinner, my favorite soup, made exactly how I liked it. She set it on the table, smiling, as if nothing had happened. I thought we could start over, she said lightly. I thanked her, but my guard stayed up. She asked casual questions. Had I been out much? Was I seeing Mrs. Watkins again? Had I changed anything important? When I didn't answer the way she wanted, her tone sharpened. You're letting people interfere, Mom. They don't care about you like I do. I met her eyes. They don't control me either. She flinched, but covered it with a smile. I'm just worried about you. I know, I said quietly. You always are. After she left, I poured the soup down the sink. It wasn't poisoned, of course, but something about it, the gesture, the performance, felt toxic in another way. The next day, I changed the locks, not out of paranoia, but to mark a boundary. I didn't owe her access to every part of my life anymore. Mrs. Watkins came by in the afternoon. When I told her what I'd done, she nodded approvingly. Good, she said. You've stopped explaining yourself. That's when they start to lose. We sat on the porch, sipping lemonade, and for the first time I laughed. Not the careful laugh I'd practiced for years, but a real one, from somewhere deep. It startled me how easy it felt. A few days later, I received a letter from the bank confirming all changes were finalized. My accounts, my property, my autonomy, all secure. I placed the letter in my lockbox and felt something close to peace. Of course, I knew it wasn't over. People like Claire didn't accept defeat quietly. She'd try again, through manipulation, through guilt, maybe through something harsher. But I was ready. That night I wrote one final entry in my notebook. Today, I stopped being managed. If she comes for me again, she'll find a woman, not a victim. I closed the notebook, locked it away, and sat by the window watching the moon rise over the quiet street. The world outside hadn't changed. The same houses, the same hum of distant traffic. But inside me, everything had shifted. For the first time since my husband's death, I didn't feel like someone's dependent. I felt whole. And I knew that whatever Claire tried next, she'd discover something she'd never expected. Her mother wasn't afraid anymore. It started with flowers. A large, over-arranged bouquet arrived one morning, lilies and white roses bound in a satin ribbon. The note read, I'm sorry if I was harsh. Let's not fight. Love, Claire. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, her public face handwriting. I placed the bouquet on the table, stared at it for a long moment, then carried it outside and left it on the porch for the wind to handle. By noon, petals had begun to scatter across the steps, soft and hollow. I watched them drift away as if the house itself was rejecting the apology. 3 days later, she appeared in person. No announcement this time, just her car rolling into the driveway, her knock quick and insistent. When I opened the door, she looked perfect, as always. Tailored coat, polished shoes, smile that could charm a courtroom. But her eyes were cautious, measuring. I thought we could have lunch, she said lightly. There's a new place downtown. My treat, I hesitated, then nodded. I wanted to see what her new strategy would be. At the restaurant, she was all warmth and nostalgia. She asked about my garden, about my reading, even about Mrs. Watkins, pretending for once that the woman was harmless. She told stories about work, about difficult clients, about how stressful her life had been lately. The food arrived, and she pushed her plate around more than she ate. Every few minutes, she'd reach across the table to touch my hand, her tone soft, almost pleading. You know, she said finally, we've always been close. I hate that there's tension between us. I looked at her, at the perfect facade she wore like armor. Tension doesn't come from nowhere, I said. She blinked, smile faltering for half a second. Then she recovered. I just think people, neighbors, lawyers, they get in your head. They make you doubt the people who love you most, I didn't answer. Silence, I'd learned, unsettled her more than argument. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. Mom, I know you're angry. But everything I've done, I did for you. You've always been too trusting. You need someone who understands how the world works. Her words used to work on me, that blend of flattery and concern. Now they just sounded tired. When I didn't respond, she sighed, theatrically gentle. I just want us to go back to normal. There's no going back, I said quietly. Something flickered in her eyes, a flash of the temper she tried so hard to hide, but she didn't let it show. She smiled instead, softer this time, almost motherly. You're making it sound so dramatic. I just want to take care of you. I looked at her hands, manicured, steady, and wondered if she even believed herself anymore. I don't need taking care of, I said. We finished lunch mostly in silence. When the bill came, she paid quickly, her jaw tight. On the way out, she hugged me, the kind of hug that feels more like restraint than affection. For the rest of the week, I didn't hear from her. Then, on Sunday, she called. Her voice was shaky this time, not controlled. She said she was lonely. That work was suffocating her, that she didn't understand why I was pushing her away. I listened, waiting for the part where sympathy would be used as leverage. It came soon enough. You don't know how much I've done for you, she said softly. How much I've sacrificed. I told her I appreciated it, but that none of it gave her ownership of my life. Her tone hardened instantly. You think those people really care about you? That neighbor, that old lawyer? They'll drop you the second they get bored. I said nothing. Don't you remember what happened to Aunt Millie? She continued. She let people interfere and they ruined her life. You're walking down the same path. The manipulation was almost elegant in its precision, invoking fear, isolation, morality. But I'd learned that fear only works if you stay silent. Claire, I said quietly, you're repeating yourself. You don't need to protect me anymore. The phone line went dead after a long pause. I spent the rest of the evening in the garden, trimming back the roses. The air was cool, and the earth smelled fresh. I thought about how control often comes disguised as love, how long it takes to recognize the difference. The next week, she sent gifts, a silk scarf, my favorite tea, a framed photo of us from years ago, each item perfectly chosen, perfectly meaningless. I placed them in a box in the closet. Then came the visit I'd expected, the one with the tears. She arrived late one afternoon, eyes red, hair disheveled, no makeup. She said she'd been thinking, that maybe she'd been wrong, that she only wanted to fix things. Her voice trembled just enough to sound believable. I made tea and listened. She told me about her childhood, how hard it had been after her father died, how she'd always felt responsible for me. There were moments I almost believed her. But when she reached the part about trust, her tone shifted ever so slightly. If you'd just sign one paper, she said softly, it would make things easier for both of us. There it was, the center of the storm, revealed in one quiet request. I looked at her and felt nothing, no anger, no pity, no fear, just clarity. I'm not signing anything, I said calmly. Her expression shattered for a second before she composed herself. You're being impossible, she whispered. Everyone's trying to help you. I know, I said, standing, and I'm helping myself. She stared at me as if seeing a stranger. Then she rose slowly, gathered her things, and left without another word. When the door closed, I realized I wasn't shaking. My heartbeat was steady. Later that evening, I opened the window and let the cool night air fill the house. Somewhere outside, I could hear Mrs. Watkins laughing with another neighbor. The sound drifted through the dark like something alive and defiant. For the first time, it didn't make me feel guilty. It made me feel connected. I realized then that Claire's power over me had never been her words or her control of my finances. It had been my silence. The belief that keeping peace was the same as keeping love. Now that silence was broken. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat by the window, and wrote in my notebook, She tried kindness the way a snake tries stillness, waiting for the right moment to strike. But I see her now, and seeing is freedom. The house felt warm, peaceful. Even the shadows seemed softer. Claire would come again, I knew. But each time she did, I would meet her with the same calm refusal. Not anger, that would feed her, just stillness. Because stillness, I realized, was the one thing she couldn't manipulate. Freedom, I learned, doesn't arrive with a shout. It seeps in quietly, like light through a crack in a closed room. The days after Claire's last visit passed without calls, without flowers, without accusations. At first, the silence felt unnatural. I kept expecting her name to flash on the phone, to hear her car in the driveway. But as hours turned to days, I realized silence could also mean safety. I started walking again, real walks, not errands. There's a small community center near the church downtown, where retirees gather for book clubs and pottery classes. I hadn't been there in years. Claire once said such places were for people who'd given up on living. On a Tuesday morning, I went anyway. The room smelled faintly of clay and coffee. About a dozen women sat around tables covered in paint-splattered newspapers. A few looked up when I entered, curious but kind. The instructor, a silver-haired woman with bright blue glasses, smiled and handed me a lump of clay. "We make mistakes in tea here," she said. "That's all you need to know." Her name was Margaret. By the end of that first class, my hands were streaked with gray dust, my shoulders sore from concentration. I hadn't created anything remarkable, just a misshapen bowl, but it felt like reclaiming a small, forgotten part of myself. When class ended, Margaret asked if I wanted to join them for coffee next door. I hesitated, then said yes. At the cafe, the conversation drifted easily between laughter and confessions. They talked about grown children who called only when they needed money, about husbands gone or indifferent, about the strange invisibility of aging. I didn't contribute much that first time, just listened. But the sound of their voices, unguarded, warm, unapologetic, felt like music. Margaret noticed my quietness. "You'll speak when you're ready," she said simply. Most of us had to relearn how. Over the following weeks, I returned every Tuesday. My bowls improved slightly, my laughter even more. One day, I mentioned Claire, vaguely, carefully. The table went still, not with judgment, but understanding. Joan, a woman with kind eyes and a soft southern accent, reached over and squeezed my hand. "Honey, some daughters don't want mothers," she said. "They want mirrors. When you stop reflecting what they like, they call it betrayal." Her words sank deep. Another woman, Irene, added, "My son did the same. Tried to make me feel small so he could feel big. Took me 50 years to stop apologizing for breathing." We laughed, not because it was funny, but because pain sounds less sharp when it echoes. That afternoon, I went home lighter. It wasn't joy yet, more like relief, the kind that comes when you realize your suffering isn't unique. Shared pain, I discovered, can be its own kind of healing. As spring turned to early summer, I found a rhythm. Morning walks, pottery classes, evenings spent reading or sitting on the porch with Mrs. Watkins. She had grown frail, but her mind was as clear as ever. We talked often about life, about motherhood, about the small cruelties hidden in good intentions. One evening she said, "We were raised to believe love meant obedience. But love without respect is just control dressed up pretty." I nodded, remembering every time I'd mistaken control for care. Later that week, she invited me to a small women's circle at the church. "It's not about religion," she said. "It's about breathing space." I went, expecting sermons. Instead, I found quiet. The women sat in a semicircle, candles flickering on a low table. We spoke about forgiveness, not for others, but for ourselves. When it was my turn, I said I wasn't ready to forgive Claire, that maybe I never would. The woman leading the session smiled gently. "Forgiveness isn't always letting them back in," she said. Sometimes it's closing the door without hate. Something in me loosened. That night, I dreamed of my husband. We were in our old kitchen, sunlight spilling across the floor. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, smiling the way he used to when I'd done something brave. I woke up with tears on my face, but a strange peace in my chest. The next morning, I opened all the windows. The air smelled of cut grass and honeysuckle. I brewed tea and sat by the window, writing in my notebook. Healing isn't revenge. It's walking away so far they can't hear your name without remembering what they lost. My handwriting was steadier now, the words surer. Around that time, Margaret suggested organizing a small exhibit of our pottery. Nothing formal, just a display at the community center. We spent days setting it up, arranging bowls and vases, our hands moving easily in quiet collaboration. When it was done, I stood back and felt an odd sense of pride. It wasn't about the clay. It was about belonging somewhere again. On the day of the exhibit, people wandered through the room, admiring the work. I caught snippets of conversations, compliments, laughter, stories. No one mentioned age, fragility, or dependence. We were creators, not caretakers. As I watched, I realized how far I'd come from the frightened woman who once believed her daughter's approval was her oxygen. I still loved Claire. That would never change. But I no longer confused love with surrender. A week later, Mrs. Watkins fell ill. I visited her daily, bringing soup and flowers. One afternoon, as I sat beside her bed, she took my hand and whispered, "You've changed, Elizabeth. You carry yourself like someone who owns her name again." Her words made my throat tighten. "You helped me find it," I said. She smiled faintly. "No, dear. You just stopped letting someone else pronounce it for you." When she passed a month later, I cried. Not the helpless tears of loss, but the clean kind, the ones that wash rather than drown. At her memorial, the church was full. Neighbors, friends, even people I didn't know stood and shared stories of her kindness. As I listened, I realized how connected we all were, women holding each other's stories together, patching the holes life had torn. After the service, Margaret found me in the crowd. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded. "Better than okay." She smiled. Then she'd be proud. Driving home that evening, the setting sun painted the houses gold. Windows glowed, children's voices carried over fences, and for the first time, the sound didn't make me feel excluded. I was part of it again. The living world, messy and real. When I reached home, I lit a candle for Mrs. Watkins and sat quietly. The flame flickered, soft and persistent. I thought about the women I'd met, about how each of us had been told, in different ways, to shrink, and how we were learning, one breath at a time, to expand again. That night, I wrote one last line in my notebook. Peace isn't silence. It's the sound of your own life coming back to you. The first real sign that I had changed came when I realized I was no longer afraid of the phone ringing. For months, that sound had filled me with dread, a symbol of intrusion, of control disguised as love. But one morning, when it rang, I looked at it, smiled faintly, and let it ring out. The silence that followed felt like applause. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was planning. Paul had finalized the new trust and sent me copies of every document. I placed them neatly in my lockbox and felt the satisfying click of the key turning. The house was legally mine again, fully and irrevocably. That same afternoon, I called the utility companies and removed Claire's name from all accounts. Each time the clerk asked for verification, I repeated my name, Elizabeth Harper, slowly, clearly, like a statement of identity. By the time I hung up, my voice had steadied into something that sounded almost unfamiliar. Confidence. I knew Claire would find out eventually, but this time, I wanted her to. The next day, I invited Margaret and Joan for tea. We sat on the porch in the late spring sunlight, the air smelling faintly of lemon balm. I told them about my decision, to take full control of my life, my property, my finances. Joan raised an eyebrow, smiling. So the Queen reclaims her throne. Margaret laughed softly. About time. Their support made something inside me settle. I realized that independence wasn't about isolation. It was about standing surrounded by people who respected your space. That evening, I wrote a letter, not to Claire, but to myself. You will not be baited by her anger, nor softened by her tears. You owe her love, not obedience. You owe yourself peace. I sealed it, placed it in my desk drawer, and decided that if ever I doubted myself again, I'd read it aloud. It didn't take long for Claire to respond. 3 days later, she appeared at my door again. No flowers this time, no gifts. Her face was tight, her eyes cold. We need to talk, she said. I stepped aside and let her in. She walked straight to the kitchen, as if she still owned the place. Why am I getting calls from the bank? She demanded. And the utilities? What exactly are you doing? I'm taking care of my own affairs, I said evenly. She laughed, short, brittle. You're making a mess. You don't know what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing, I replied. She stared at me, waiting for me to soften, to explain. When I didn't, her mask began to crack. You're listening to those people, she said. That old lawyer, that neighbor. They've turned you against your own family. I didn't need anyone to turn me, I said quietly. You did that yourself. Her jaw tightened. You're throwing everything away. For what? Pride? For peace, I said. She slammed her hand on the table, hard enough to rattle the cups. Do you even hear yourself? You sound insane. The word didn't land the way she wanted it to. Once it would have cut deep. Now it floated past me like smoke. I met her gaze steadily. You can leave, Claire. I'm not doing this anymore. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, realizing she'd lost this round, she straightened, smoothed her hair, and said in a low voice, You'll regret this. I already regretted everything that came before, I said. She left without looking back. The moment her car disappeared around the corner, I closed the door, leaned against it, and exhaled. I wasn't trembling. I wasn't angry. I was calm, and that calm felt invincible. But I also knew the storm wasn't over. Claire wasn't the kind to walk away quietly. The next week, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was someone from her office, polite but evasive. They asked strange questions. Had I been feeling mentally clear lately? Was anyone helping me with decisions? I recognized the tactic immediately. She was testing the waters, seeing if she could build a case for incompetence. I ended the call without answering. Then I called Paul. He sighed when I told him. It's not uncommon, he said. I'll make sure all your documentation is airtight. If she tries anything, she'll have no ground to stand on. The next day, I went to his office and signed an affidavit declaring my full mental capacity. I brought copies home and placed one on my refrigerator, a quiet warning to anyone who might doubt me. Claire didn't call for 2 weeks. I assumed she was regrouping, recalculating. I went on with my life. The pottery classes continued. The garden flourished. I joined a local volunteer group that helped elderly residents manage paperwork, ironic considering where I'd started. Helping others who'd been manipulated, hearing their stories, that became my quiet revenge. I saw my own reflection in their confusion and fear, and it made me stronger to know I could guide them through it. One afternoon, while sorting donations at the community center, I overheard 2 women talking about a daughter who'd drained her mother's savings account. The mother had been too afraid to press charges. I walked over, gently introduced myself, and said, You're not crazy, and you're not alone. The woman's eyes filled with tears. We talked for an hour. When she left, she hugged me tightly. That night I wrote in my notebook, Strength isn't always the roar of victory. Sometimes it's the quiet act of teaching someone else how to fight. The following Sunday, I found a letter slipped under my door. I recognized Claire's handwriting immediately. The envelope wasn't sealed. Inside, a single page. You've made your choice. I hope you're happy with your new friends. Don't expect me to be there when they leave you like everyone else has. I folded the letter neatly, placed it in the trash, and didn't think about it again. Instead, I went outside, the air heavy with the scent of summer rain. Across the street, children were riding bikes, laughter echoing through the evening. Mrs. Levin, the neighbor 2 houses down, waved from her porch. I waved back, feeling something warm expand in my chest. Not joy, exactly, but belonging. When I went back inside, I stood before the mirror. My reflection looked older, yes, lined, weathered, but not small. My eyes were steady, my shoulders relaxed. For years, I'd measured my worth by how well I could keep peace. Now I understood peace wasn't something to keep. It was something to claim. Claire could send letters, make calls, stir rumors. None of it mattered anymore. Because whatever storm she brought next, I would meet it not as a frightened mother, but as a woman who had finally learned how to resist. And I was ready. It began with a knock at the door early one Thursday morning. I was washing dishes when I heard it. Firm, official, the kind of knock that doesn't belong to neighbors or friends. When I opened the door, 2 people stood there, a woman in a navy blazer and a man holding a clipboard. They introduced themselves as representatives from Adult Protective Services. My first thought was confusion. The second was cold understanding. Claire, the woman smiled politely. We've received a report expressing concern about your well-being, Mrs. Harper. May we come in for a brief conversation? For a moment, my hands trembled, but I stepped aside and gestured toward the living room. Of course, I said. Please, sit. They began asking questions about my health, my finances, my daily routines. Their tone was calm, almost rehearsed. I recognized the careful neutrality of professionals trained not to reveal judgment. Had anyone been taking advantage of me? Did I feel safe in my home? Was there a trusted relative helping manage my affairs? Each question was a blade wrapped in velvet. I answered clearly, steadily, offering documents whenever appropriate. Bank statements, medical reports, the notarized letter from Paul verifying my capacity. I even offered them tea. When they finally looked at each other and nodded, the woman said, "Everything seems in order, Mrs. Harper. Thank you for your time." Sometimes these reports are simply misunderstandings. I smiled faintly. I imagine so. When they left, I closed the door, locked it, and leaned against it for a moment. My legs were steady, but inside me something cold and sharp had solidified. This wasn't just manipulation anymore. This was war. I called Paul immediately. When I explained what had happened, his tone hardened. "She's overstepped," he said. "That's actionable harassment." By that afternoon, he'd filed a cease and desist letter addressed directly to Claire. It was brief, firm, and devastating in its precision. It stated that any further attempts to interfere with my affairs would result in legal consequences. I read the letter twice before signing. My hands didn't shake this time. A week passed with silence. Then came the backlash. Rumors began circulating in the neighborhood that I was losing touch, that I'd been confused about finances, that I'd fallen under bad influence. I could hear it in the way people greeted me, kind, cautious, uncertain. Even Mrs. Levin looked uneasy when she waved from her porch. It didn't take much to trace the source. Claire's whispers traveled faster than the wind. At first, I considered ignoring it. Then, one morning at the community center, I found Margaret waiting by the door, newspaper in hand. "You've seen this?" she asked. On the second page was a small column, a local business piece about a respected real estate agent facing personal family struggles. Claire's name wasn't mentioned, but mine was. The description was unmistakable. A retired widow suffering from confusion, whose daughter has been forced to intervene to protect family assets. It was elegant, calculated, defamation dressed as concern. I felt my chest tighten, then ease again. I'd expected this. The timing was perfect, just after the cease and desist, just before she lost every legal hold. I called Paul again. His tone was calm, almost approving. "She's panicking," he said. "People lash out when they lose control." "We'll handle it," and he did. Within days, his office sent a response to the paper, formal, factual, accompanied by documentation proving every one of Claire's claims false. They printed a correction in the next issue, small but clear. Still, I wasn't satisfied with quiet correction. For years, I'd been silent. Now I wanted to be heard. I agreed to speak with a local journalist, a woman named Hannah, who'd covered community issues before. I told her everything, not in anger, but in truth. I showed her the letters, the reports, the trust documents, the cease and desist. When the article came out 2 weeks later, the headline was simple. "When protection becomes control, one woman's fight for autonomy." It wasn't vindictive. It was powerful. It told the story of a generation of women whose children had turned concern into cages. The story spread, modestly, quietly, but enough that people began stopping me in the street. Neighbors who'd once looked at me with pity now looked at me with respect. Some even apologized for believing the rumors. Claire, of course, called. Her voice was icy. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've humiliated me." My boss saw that article. I let her speak, let her words run out. Then I said, "Everything I said was true." "That doesn't matter," she snapped. "You made me look like a monster." "You did that yourself," I said softly. There was a pause, then a low, bitter laugh. "You think this is over?" "I can fix this, Mom. I always fix things I know," I said. "That's the problem." She hung up. 2 days later, I received word that she'd been suspended from work pending investigation into unethical practices, the same kind of manipulation Mrs. Watkins had warned me about months ago. The firm found irregularities in her clients' contracts. She'd been taking commissions under other names, using elderly clients' trust to her advantage. It was almost poetic, the truth she'd buried in others' lives surfacing to consume her own. I didn't celebrate. I just felt finished. That evening, I sat on the porch, watching the sunset spread gold across the lawns. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the neighborhood was quiet. Margaret called to tell me she'd read the follow-up article, the one about Claire's suspension. "You handled it beautifully," she said. "I didn't handle anything," I replied. "It handled itself." She laughed softly. "That's what happens when you stop protecting people from the truth." When I hung up, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, not relief, but a deep, still certainty. Claire had always seen herself as the savior, but in the end, she'd become the author of her own undoing. I wrote one last entry in my notebook that night. She taught me control. I taught her consequences. The next morning, I woke early, brewed coffee, and opened the window. The sound of birds filled the room. Across the street, Mrs. Levin waved again, this time with a smile that reached her eyes. The world had returned to its natural rhythm, and I, for the first time in years, was entirely free. Autumn arrived quietly that year, with a kind of calm I'd never known before. The trees turned gold early, the air smelled of rain and wood smoke, and for once, I didn't feel the passing of time as loss, only as movement. It had been 4 months since the article, 3 since Claire's suspension, 2 since the silence became permanent. At first, I thought I'd miss her, the sound of her voice, the quick visits, the illusion of closeness. But I didn't. What I missed, I realized, wasn't her. It was the idea of family I'd invented to make her behavior bearable. Reality, stripped of illusion, was lighter. I filled my days easily. Mornings began with walks to the cafe where Margaret and Joan waited, their laughter already rising above the hum of conversation. Sometimes we planned community events. Sometimes we sat in comfortable silence. I'd become the quiet one of the group, not withdrawn, just peaceful. At the community center, my pottery had improved. The bowls I made now were symmetrical, smooth, and simple, practical things made to be used. Margaret once joked that they looked like they'd been made by someone who had stopped apologizing. Maybe she was right. I began teaching a class myself, basic pottery for beginners. Mostly women my age, a few younger ones too. We spent as much time talking as working. It wasn't just about clay, it was about reclaiming space. When one woman confessed she felt trapped caring for her adult son, I smiled and said, "Freedom doesn't need permission. It only needs a decision." Each time I said words like that, I could feel Mrs. Watkins somewhere smiling. Life became small, deliberate, beautiful. I read novels in the evenings, tended my garden, cooked for myself again. Simple meals, but full of intention. Herbs from my own pots, bread that filled the house with warmth. Sometimes, when the sky turned violet just before sunset, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the neighborhood lights come on one by one. No longer observing from exile, but belonging. People waved again. Real waves this time, not the hesitant kind. The rumors had faded, replaced by a kind of quiet respect. "That's Mrs. Harper," I once overheard a young mother telling her child. "She's strong." She stood up for herself. I smiled, not out of pride, but out of recognition. Then, one afternoon, I saw Claire again. It was in the grocery store, sudden, unexpected. She looked smaller somehow, her posture tense, her eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. For a moment, she didn't notice me. When she finally did, she froze, her face flickering between anger and shame. "Mom," she said quietly. I nodded. "Claire." She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You look good." "So do you," I said, though it wasn't true. We stood there for a few seconds in the awkward hum of the refrigerated aisle. She looked as if she wanted to say something more, but couldn't find the right words. I could almost feel the weight of her pride pressing down on her. Finally, she asked, "Are you still angry?" I thought about that for a moment. "No," I said honestly. "Anger's heavy." I put it down. She nodded slowly, swallowing hard. "I lost my job," she admitted. "No one wants to work with me now." "People talk. I know," I said softly. She glanced up, eyes wet but defiant. "I didn't mean for things to go this way." "I believe that," I said. "But you made choices." She looked away, blinking fast. "So did you." "Yes," I said. "And for once I made the right ones." There was no venom in it, just truth. She hesitated, then said, "I thought I was helping you." "You were helping yourself," I replied. The words landed, quiet and final. She nodded, her lips trembling slightly, then turned and walked away. I watched her go, pushing the cart like a woman half her size, shoulders slumped beneath invisible weight. I didn't follow. When I left the store, the air outside was cool and clean. The world felt wide again. I realized I didn't hate her. I just didn't owe her anything anymore. That night, I sat by the window, the candle burning low. I thought about the strange symmetry of it all, how her attempts to control me had destroyed her, and how my resistance had saved me. Paul called the next morning to tell me Claire had officially lost her license. The investigation had concluded. Multiple cases of fraud, coerced signatures, falsified documents. She was facing legal consequences, possibly even a trial. I thanked him, but there was no triumph in my voice, only closure. After the call, I walked to the garden. The roses had bloomed again, late in the season, but full and bright. I knelt and touched one gently, feeling the softness of its petals. It had taken pruning, sunlight, and time to return, just like me. In the following weeks, I began writing, not in my old notebook, but in a new one, clean pages untouched. I didn't write about pain or revenge this time. I wrote about quiet mornings, about clay under my hands, about the smell of earth after rain. Sometimes in the middle of writing, I'd catch myself smiling for no reason. It felt strange, almost foreign, to feel peace that wasn't borrowed from someone else's approval. By winter, my class at the community center had doubled in size. Younger women joined too. Women juggling work, family, and exhaustion. I saw in their eyes the same confusion I'd once seen in my own reflection. They called me Mrs. Harper, but sometimes Elizabeth, and once someone called me mentor. The word startled me. It felt too big, too heavy. But as I watched them laughing, learning, shaping the clay into imperfect beauty, I thought maybe it fit. Around Christmas, I received a card. No return address, just a short note inside. I'm sorry. For everything. Claire. There was no explanation, no plea for forgiveness, just that. I placed it in my notebook between pages filled with sunlight and sea air, and I left it there, a fragment of the past, preserved but powerless. The new year came softly. On January 1st, I stood outside, the morning air crisp and clean. The neighborhood was quiet, blanketed in pale frost. I thought of the woman I'd been a year ago, timid, unsure, shrinking to fit someone else's version of love. She was gone now. In her place stood someone who could look at the horizon without fear of what was behind her. When the sun rose, I whispered to myself, not as a wish but as a vow. I will never again mistake control for care. I will never again apologize for living. Then I went back inside, brewed coffee, and opened my window wide to let in the light. The air smelled of a new beginning.